really is about your learning. So let us know your questions along the way. Matthew is eager to share about his knowledge, but I know that you guys have had some good experience too. So please pop those into the chat. We'd love to hear your stories and your experiences. Thanks so much for coming today. Matthew, it's all yours.
Thanks, Kelsey. I'm excited to be here to talk about this topic. I think, we live in a place where winter dominates so much of our year. And I think for all of the reasons, mental health, physical health, that getting outside in the winter is essential. Whether it's a walk around the neighborhood or even out deep into the wilderness. So the goal today is, and there's a lot of ways that we can cover this topic. So I think we're gonna, where this conversation goes, I have a lot of information to share, but where we focus will depend on those of you that are here and the interests that you have. And the specific areas that you may be bringing with you that you want to know and understand more about. Kelsey, I love that you sort of, referenced me as a sort of seasoned traveler in the outdoors. And I was just in the Boundary Waters doing a winter piece for the Save the Boundary Waters campaign, and it was all about winter. And for this piece, I've been interviewing some folks. One example I'll give, and I'll talk about her a few times in the presentation today, is a woman named Emily Ford. And right now she is skiing across the entire Boundary Waters Canoe Area Wilderness, starting in Crane Lake, and her goal is to end at Lake Superior. And to me, that is this beyond adventure that I'm like, well, I don't know if I could ever do that. And so no matter what, the reason I share that story and I share about Emily is that each of us has a place of comfort that we bring at this moment right now, like what I'm comfortable getting out and doing. And there's always going to be somebody who's doing something more extreme and somebody who's maybe not at the same level that I'm at. And understanding that we're all in a spectrum of comfort and skill and ability is essential, because we're going to be talking about how we evaluate realistically what our capacities are for getting out and doing those things. So I hope that makes sense. Just a little bit more about me. I grew up, actually, I was born in Dallas, Texas. So the opposite of like what I consider as a natural environment. My family moved to La Crosse, Wisconsin when I was a teenager. And I just want to share this story, especially as people are sort of logging in and getting into the conversation. And this is a sort of coming of age experience as far as getting out. It's not winter, but when I was 15, a friend of mine from church youth group and I decided to go on a canoe trip, a 3-day canoe trip down the Black River with a borrowed aluminum canoe. And we packed our gear. We put sleeping bags in garbage bags to try to keep them dry. We brought far too many things. And right after lunch on our first day of paddling, we encountered a large set of rapids. And on those rapids, the whole river kind of funneled into a chute and dropped a significant amount. And we took that chute and we nosed right into a boulder, capsized our canoe. That's where my memory gets pretty blurry. But the next thing I remember is floating down the river. Our canoe is pinned on a boulder in the rapids. And so long story short, we had to get out of that situation. And two 15-year-olds, pre-cell phones, all our stuff is soaking wet, and we had to adapt, not to survive, but to stay comfortable until my friend's mom was going to pick us up a couple of nights later. And, whether you're going out for a day trip or for a multi-night trip, the reality is that a mistake or an accident let's say small A accident or some sort of mishap, it's probably going to happen on just about every trip you go on, where there's going to be an experience where you think, oh, I will do it differently next time. And that is a natural part of getting comfortable, especially in the winter, of constantly evaluating what you're going to be doing differently. So that dynamic will be a big part of our presentation. So just to get comfortable with Zoom, and that I'm very comfortable interacting in person. And so getting this interaction with all of you, I can see the names on the list, will be a bit new for me. So to kind of get us into Zoom, the question that would help me know is, what is the most important thing that you want to learn in this presentation today? And Kelsey was sharing with me that people can share out loud. So if you're comfortable putting your thoughts in the chat, that would be, if that's easiest for you, go ahead and do that. Maybe Kelsey can read a few of those. If you'd like to share, it'd be great. You can raise your hand kind of down at the bottom and chime in on what's important for you to learn today. So I'm going to just give everybody a minute.
So I'll say mine out loud while you guys are thinking, is that I was hearing about families going out and hiking on waterfalls. And I thought, gosh, that looks incredible. I saw these pictures and I thought, I have a 4-year-old. Is that appropriate for a 4-year-old? I'm not sure it's even appropriate for me, and I'm 42 years old. And kind of like, what is the athletic ability that is needed to do that? Or what is the materials? And that just is a perfect example of, there is all these things I hear about people doing, and I don't necessarily know where even to start. So just learning from you, even where to start is a good place.
Yeah, so I heard in that answer kind of not only assessing your own ability, but the ability of family members or other folks that are coming along, and assessing what's safe, and specifically rivers. So we can definitely talk about rivers today. I think that's a super important topic, especially because it's gotten a little bit of local press recently with some river debacles. Which I have definitely more than a few of those types of stories that we can share as well. So good, great. Go ahead.
Yeah, we are getting somebody that said they want to know a little bit more about hiking, about the SHT and how to be hiking on SHT and what they might need to even get started with that. I also have on here, I have some experience with basic wilderness safety, especially during warmer months. Would love to talk about planning, troubleshooting for winter outings in particular. And then another one, Matthew, just so you know, as we shared this on the Boundary Waters group chat, and they had some questions about, for those that are considering winter versus there maybe are well-seasoned summer travelers. I think as Catherine mentioned, it's not the same. And so what's different, and what do they need to know differently?
Awesome. Yes, that's great. So I'm hearing the spectrum, right, of just getting out on the SHT in the winter has its own challenges. We'll definitely cover some of the super important basics of that. And if there's a specific question that comes up that doesn't get answered, please ask. Also, all the way to overnights and travel in the Boundary Waters, I think is super important, because it's an amazing place to go in the winter and there's way less people. Any more before we keep going? All right.
I think we're good now, but I encourage you, if you come up with an idea or something that you're like, oh, that makes me think about it, please put it into the chat or unmute yourself.
Right. So we could try this one more time, but I think the place that I always start when I think about planning any trip, but especially important as any winter trip, is just like the basic survival needs, because it's from our sort of most simple survival needs that we build on our preparedness. So if you're thinking about this, either come up with in your head, start to list off basic survival needs, put them in the chat, and just see if you're tuned in to what those things are, because we're going to start with the most basic. Hopefully these things were on your mind or in your list. but they're worth naming. So whenever I am thinking about getting out, right, we're just talking about food, water, shelter, and one that I think doesn't get talked about enough, which is a positive mental attitude. And so we're going to hit some of those things today. But I think it's worth naming that where most folks get into trouble, we talked a little bit about the fact that something will probably go wrong on whether it's snowshoeing on the SHT and, starts to get dark and you're a lot further away than you thought, or realizing you forgot something to start a fire. If you're winter camping in the Boundary Waters, there's always something that will probably go wrong. And where most folks get into trouble is when that thing that is unexpected happens, and it can start a cascade of catastrophic thinking. And what we know is that when our brains are in those fight or flight places, in the fight or flight portions of our brain, we're not engaged in problem solving very effectively. And so this presentation today, going through some really practical steps of preparedness, can empower you to say, okay, I know what to do if something happens. I have these tools in my pack and they're always coming along with me, and I don't have to panic. And I probably can figure out what to do. And so that is, it's not a concrete tool, but it is an important one. So when I just want to talk about some basics like food. So, it's been a cold winter, and whenever we're getting out, we want to make sure we're putting the right nutrition in our body. So, I sort of put this in two categories. There's like cold food, especially if you're just going out for a day hike. And then there's the hot food that you're going to need to have a stove with you. Now, on certain trips, like especially if I'm going into the Boundary Waters, even for a day trip, or on a river for a day trip, I have a small stove that I usually throw in just in case I end up staying out longer than I planned. But you want to have, you want to think about, I think a great way to think about this is a trail mix. So in trail mix, you have nuts, raisins, maybe you got some chocolate chips or M&Ms. So you've got your fat with the nuts, you've got your sugar with the raisins, and that those are two essential things your body needs just to function. Sugar gets your glucose up, helps your brain stay engaged, and the fat just gives you something to burn, which actually keeps your body warm. On all of my cold trips, especially overnight, my favorite way to keep my body warm is heating up water, making tea. It's just drinking hot water, keeps my body warm, keeps me hydrated. And your body is able to work effectively when you're hydrated. So the more hydrated you get, the less your body is able to regulate its own temperature, which is something you may have noticed when you're getting dehydrated and you're outside. You may have a hard time keeping that temperature stable. So those are two important things to hit. And so I'll get into one of the big challenges with hydration in the wintertime. Super simple, but water freezes in the winter. And if you're going out for any amount of time, whether that's on the SHT or for many nights, you got to deal with the water situation. It's an easy one to forget. So for example, a Nalgene, you fill up your 24-ounce Nalgene bottle, put it in your pack, and you head out, and you're on like a 5-degree day. It's going to freeze really quick. One simple trick: keep that Nalgene upside down. Then the mouth doesn't freeze, and you can drink out of that Nalgene. Excuse me. But most importantly, one thing I do before every trip is boil water, fill up all my thermoses, and toss those in. You're going to want that water liquid when you got to drink it. And then the other question is, how are you going to access more water? Easy on a river, there's spaces to access water, but especially if you're going into the Boundary Waters, you're either bringing all the water in that you need, which gets really, really heavy. if you're ice fishing, you got an auger, and that's great. You can drill your holes and I drink straight out of the lakes in the boundary waters in the winter. I've never had any issues, but if that is something that causes you concern, or if you're not sure about, where you're drinking out of, bring a filter to purify. So just important thing is to make sure you have a plan to keep your water liquid. Once it freezes, it won't do you much good. A stove works well too. And, I think a lot of people think, well, I can melt snow, but actually like you can fill up a giant pot full of snow. And once it all melts down, you don't have a whole lot of water and you're wasting a lot of precious fuel that way. So finding other ways to get your water is super helpful. And if questions are popping up for people as we hit these, throw them in the chat and we'll make sure to come back to them, or Kelsey will bring them up. Okay. I think food is fairly intuitive. Water, beyond keeping it from freezing, is fairly intuitive. Shelter, I think, is the most important of those first three. So the food, water, shelter. And I want you to think like, and I'm always really curious about this because a lot of different things come to people's mind when they think of shelter, or why are we even talking about shelter if we're going on day trips? So if you have some ideas, throw them in the chat. You can raise your hand because I'm curious what people think of.
Well, I tossed in chat as other people are thinking and want to toss things in is maybe an emergency blanket, especially if you're doing a short trip. That seems like a potential option, but I don't really know if that would really work if you're going more in depth into the woods, or, is one enough to cover you and your child and a husband that's 6 foot? I don't really know how many you need for, if that is the thing that you can use.
That's a great question, Kelsey. We are going to talk about emergency blankets for sure, and definitely worth bringing along. I think you're getting into the most important element of shelter, which is the fact that shelter is anything that protects you from the elements. So your clothing is just as much of a shelter item as an emergency blanket, as an emergency bivvy, a tent, or anything like that. So we're going to talk a little bit about some of the essentials of shelter. And as we get,
Matthew, a couple of the ideas that people had, they have a variety. We got a snow cave. We got a tarp tent, snow landscape base shelters. We have a tarp to protect from the wind. And they have something that I've never heard of before, but Bivvy bag, Bivuak bag, or C bag. Those are what we got on the list.
It's a bivouac bag.
Ah, yes. Thank you, Tyler. Appreciate it.
Tyler, do you feel courageous to educate people on that real quick?
I have a bivouac bag that I keep in my truck when I travel in the wintertime. It's pretty much a sleeping bag or a bigger, it's like a small tent, essentially. I can get my sleeping bag inside of it. It has some metal poles to give me some space around my head, but it just keeps the wind off and the rain off. It's protected on the bottom, on the floor of the unit itself, so I can snuggle into that if necessary.
Well, I think you had a really good point. And I was expecting Matthew to do it, but after we were just hearing about the people stuck on the highway down in, I think, Virginia, it does take that emergency, you think you might be just going towards a travel and not even be actually to the travel destination yet. And some of your emergency equipment might be helpful to be put to use. Totally.
And I would imagine that there are lots of people in this presentation who have an emergency kit in their car like Tyler does. And that is an excellent way of being prepared when driving, right? For those situations where you could get stranded. And I think I exercise that same concept. I have a few emergency items that go with me just about any time of year, but especially in the winter. And those are often around the concepts of shelter. for you, Kelsey, I use the word bivvy. It's a short for, I have a hard time saying bivouac. So feel free to use that. So an emergency bivvy, emergency blanket, and other forms of shelter, because anything that protects you from the elements, like a tarp. A tarp can be amazing when we think about what is the sort of type of weather that kind of intimidates most of us the most is the wind, because we understand living up here that the wind can, at a 25-degree day with high wind can feel a whole lot colder than a 5-degree day with no wind. And so a tarp is amazing for protecting you from the wind, and loving that people use that for shelter. Some other examples, going back to this sort of having an emergency preparedness kit that you keep in the bottom of your pack. And I didn't do a slide on this, and so I'm glad it came up. Any type of fire starter. So that can be a lighter, matches, waterproof matches, some sort of tinder, like lint from your dryer, or even like rolling up birch bark and sticking it in there. I have a couple of different pill bottles that I have that have those items in it. And so I think of those all as shelter items to create warmth and protect from the elements. Okay, we're almost there. But okay, one of the most important, so this applies to any time that you're going outside. And to me, this is the most important thing about winter travel is how you dress. My travels in the winter changed dramatically when I started to get that dialed in. And the layering system is really the most important. So I've got a picture here on the PowerPoint that kind of helps, but we'll start from skin and work our way out. So we have our base layer. Base layer is not cotton. That's most important. So it is the wicking layer. It pulls, anytime you sweat, it pulls the sweat away, from your body. And that's important because, we know that we don't want to get wet when we're outside in the winter. We don't want to fall in the lake or fall in the river, but really the most risky moisture comes from our own body. And so having especially a merino wool layer on your top and your bottom is essential. So it brings the moisture away from your body. And so once we graduate from that, we get into the insulating layers. So the things that help trap the heat. I have all sorts of insulating layers, and this can be your puffy jacket, some really nice wintergreen mushers jackets. I usually do, because I change my layers a lot, and taking on and putting on layers often is a key to staying dry. And to prevent that risk of too much moisture in your clothing. So this jacket that I wear outside in the fall is the same jacket that I'm also wearing after my base layer, even in the winter, because it's light, it has some insulating qualities, and if I get too hot, I can shed my other layers. And a fleece, that's one of my favorites. So a good dense fleece is going to help with insulation. Some people prefer a puffy, but one challenge with a puffy is that as you compress down, it loses some of its insulating quality. And that gets us to our last layer, which is our shell. So something that is waterproof. Now, you won't always need something waterproof if it's not snowing. You may not need a waterproof shell. But, even if you're out in the snow, as you're creating heat, as your body's generating heat from activity and you have snow falling on, let's say, even your puffy or your fleece, when I generate enough heat, the snow starts to melt on my shoulders. It starts to melt on my upper back because I'm generating heat. And so having a shell to keep that snow off the body, so to keep your clothing dry, is super important. One thing that sealed the deal for me for winter camping is Puffy Pants. Now they are a bit of an investment. This is a Mountain Hardwear Puffy Pant. But I was out in the boundary waters twice this year with evening temperatures lower than -20. And these babies were amazing. And I hope that I have them the rest of my life because they cost a lot. But you can also have, so there's shells too for bottom layers. And I like bibs because they don't fall off and they stay up. So this gets back to pertaining to anything, whether it's a day hike on the SHT or whether you're going multi-nights in the boundary waters, having the ability to, especially when you get these big temperature swings, whether the day is changing in temperature or you're doing, on the Sawtooth Mountains, on the SHT especially, you got long uphills. And so it's best not to wait until you're drenched in sweat before you take a layer off. It's can become habit to anticipate when your body's starting to heat up. If you always have a day pack on you, you can take off a puffy, take off a fleece, and stick it in that pack. And then when you get to the top of that hill, and after you start to cool down, and then you're doing a long downhill, you can pull those back on. And that's, on some of the trips that I've been on with first timers, and you have folks that may be used to ice fishing where they're not moving. So they've got decked out in all their ice fishing gear, which keeps them really warm sitting around. But as soon as you start skiing or snowshoeing, or even pulling a sled, you're gonna be way too hot. So super important is layering. This is a shout out for Tyler and Kelsey. We've got two of the items that you both mentioned. The emergency bivvy is the one on the left. You can kind of see a picture of what that can look like, although this looks like a super simple version of what Tyler has. And then those awesome emergency blankets, these like giant aluminum foil blankets. I think so many people have one. Kelsey, have you ever used yours? No.
No, like rot, right? Like, no, maybe not rot, but like you have them until they fall apart in the packaging.
Yeah. Yeah. If there's anybody in this in this Zoom call that has used their emergency blanket, I'd love to hear about it. I used mine one time.
I've used the emergency blanket. We went camping and my daughter brought a sleepover sleeping bag rather than something of value. So I gave her my sleeping bag, nice form-fit mummy bag down, and took her little, I think it was My Little Pony sleeping bag, and stretched out the emergency blanket over it and under it, and I survived the night.
Congratulations, Tyler.
Just barely survived the night.
My Little Pony wasn't quite enough for you, huh?
No, just didn't cut it.
Yeah, and I bet you were, would you mind sharing how cold it got on that particular trip?
You should see my face here. It got down to about 40 that night. We were fall camping in one of the state parks. I think it was William O'Brien or something like that. And she wasn't comfortable. We had the Insulite pads underneath us, but over the top, she wasn't ready. So Dad had to share. And it was a pre-warmed bag too, which she lucked out on there as well.
Thank you, Tyler.
My pleasure.
Yeah, and that's the thing, is you never know what, again, back to sort of mishaps that can occur. I've been on trips where, you're already out in the boundary waters and somebody didn't pack their sleeping bag. And those are, obviously you don't want to ever be in that situation. But having something accessible, if you can't come up with a solution to go back and get what you need, is super important. I used the emergency blanket, I think on that canoe trip I talked about at the beginning of the presentation, because our sleeping bags were so waterlogged, and it was cotton sleeping bags and they weren't drying out. And I could wrap up in the emergency blanket and be in the sleeping bag and not have the moisture on my body and still got some of the insulating qualities. So it did help, and I did get a little bit of rest. But they make a lot of noise, as I'm sure Tyler can attest to. The Bivvies are super cool too. I just want to give a shout to those. Again, like, maybe your Bivvy is a tarp, and I love that people mention that. Serves the same purpose, is just getting the wind away from your body and creating a shelter around you to protect yourself. Okay, this, I think, idea is such an important one. So, what I really want to, by the end of this, we're hopefully going to do a little brainstorming, but the idea is that you're never out on any type of trip where you haven't thought through some version of what can happen. And so having that those emergency tools in your backpack with you, having all the layers that you may need with you, and knowing what's going to happen with the weather. So this is the weather for this week. And, one thing I love about Weather Underground is not that it's always accurate, but it gets more and more accurate the closer it gets to the dates. But I love their graphs. And these graphs really help you dial in what's going to be happening with the weather. So a good example here is, I think, this coming Saturday, the 12th. So if I were to just look at the highs and lows forecasted for the 12th, I would see, let's see, I think it's high of 19, low of 13. Well, if you look closer at the graph, there's a red line, and that red line actually indicates the temperatures. So on Friday, it actually says that the temp's going to get down to -3. And according to that graph, that's actually right before dawn on Saturday morning. So let's say you plan for nothing lower than 13 degrees on Saturday, and you get an early morning start, and you're actually out at the coldest part of the day, and it's going to be 3 degrees. Or, maybe that's not going to have a huge impact, but looking at the big picture of what the weather is going to be like, and how that could impact your trip and your planning is just a really important way of getting prepared. All right, one of the ideas that I like to talk about is not what to do with when you get lost, but how you make sure you always stay found. I think, most of us own one of the easiest resources to know where we are, and that is our phones. And that is an increasingly accessible way to stay found. A lot of times when I'm bushwhacking in the front country, especially, so anything on the Spear hiking trail, or especially bushwhacking through the Superior National Forest, I usually have my phone on and my GPS on. And it's good to know that if you have your GPS on, if you have a map open or an app that shows your location, that GPS will usually stay on even when you lose cell phone service. You may have experienced this if you ever, like, you go up the Gunflint Trail and you have something in on your maps, you lose service, but your GPS, your maps app will continue to function. So if you have the foresight to do that, it can serve you really well, and so that if you kind of lose track of where you are in your surroundings, you haven't lost track of where you are on a device. There are a few other resources, Garmin, Gaia. These are all GPS maps, apps or devices that can connect you with satellites, not just for staying found and knowing your location, but also in case of an emergency. I'm going to share a quick example of this on my, let's see if I can. So I talked about Emily Ford a little bit earlier. This is Emily Ford's location via a Garmin device as of 6:30 this morning. So you can see where she's at on her, this is her route that she's been taking through the Boundary Waters, starting a couple of weeks back here in Crane Lake, and she's working her way through. And as of this morning, she stayed overnight on the portage coming out of Rose Lake on the border lakes and the boundary waters. So if you wanted to go on an overnight trip, and let's say you had a family member that wanted to be able to keep an eye on you and know where you were going and where you were, and maybe even communicate with you, you can use a device like this so that folks can keep an eye on you, like I'm keeping an eye on Emily, and even communicate if you need to. And the communications come such a long ways that you can actually pair your phone with these devices and kind of piggyback on them to use some features. But they can get really cool. I just like to show this. You know, you can get all the way down into this almost a real-time view here. Yeah, so I think it's important also to know, what are you going to do if your technology fails? So I've made this mistake before, not having, not in the boundary waters, because I love map reading there, but in other places out west, of not having a hard copy map. But, you know, this is a Mackenzie map of that same area that we just saw Emily on. You know, I doubt that Emily took a hard map of all the areas that she is traveling in the boundary waters, and hopefully she has a backup plan. But it's not enough just to have a map like this. Knowing how to read them is really, really important. And so, you know, I think bigger picture with some of these ideas about winter is that if you don't know how to use a tool or a piece of technology, if you don't know how to use your fire starter, practice before you go out. And that, you know, you can do that in your yard. Practice reading a map in a place that you are familiar with, or, you know, set up your bivvy sack or your tent or whatever before you head out. So the first time I ever went hot tent camping, so using a canvas wall tent in the wilderness. And I just want to sing the praises of the canvas wall tent and stove, you know, that you can rent or borrow from friends for winter camping. It was the way that I learned to feel comfortable in the boundary waters in the winter. But I didn't wait until I got into the boundary waters to set up the tent and learn how to start the stove. It's something that I set up and used in my backyard for the first time, so that when I got out there, I felt comfortable, because I struggled to figure out using the stove effectively. And with the comfort of my home right there, it allowed me to continue to have a positive mental attitude. And so if I was struggling to start my stove out in the boundary waters when it's 6 degrees or below zero, it's a good chance I could have lost it a little bit. And so again, practice and take baby steps before you go out. And that is, I think, one of the most important things to continue to come back to.
You know, Matthew, it's interesting you're talking about this, because I think I've seen on Facebook somebody mention that if your phone is running out of signal, you should call and leave a message on your voicemail saying where you are, and like things like that. Is there any good tips around cell phone usage, I guess, or like what you should or shouldn't do in the outdoors with that in mind?
Totally. I'm gonna say two things about that, Kelsey, and thanks for bringing that up. If at all possible, make sure to always tell somebody where you're going. That's, I think, comes up in a little bit of a later slide, but I try to never be anywhere without having either texting somebody and say, you know, I'm gonna go ski up the Devil Track. I should be done by 4. If you don't hear from me, call me. So even sending a quick text or checking in with somebody is a good thing to do. I like that idea of sending, leaving somebody a message if your phone's about to die. But I think the idea is that you never have to get into that place, right? Like that you never get lost because you've already known how to stay found. And if you've done your preparation, if you know where you're going, and if you've let somebody know before you've gone out, and when you're going to check in when you're done, then you don't have to have that panicked phone call while your cell phone is losing battery.
Well, as we know, in this neck of the woods, cell phone reception is spotty at best, and even in town sometimes. So, I've heard that you should be texting instead, because that might try again if you miss, if the reception's not great in the spot and uses less power. But it's all, based on where you are in the situation. I was just going to mention, I know that you said like letting people know where you are and like when you might be back. But I know that in real life, this has happened. My father's a big skier, and he's going to go out and he's going to go for a big ski. But what I determine the right amount of time for him to be missing in action might be different than what he would determine the right amount of time. And especially if he's like having it's bad wax or, situational that might be fine in his mind, but to us might not be. I'm wondering if you would recommend people give kind of like a time frame. Like, I think this is going to take me 6 hours, but it could actually take me 12 hours on a bad day.
Right.
Just in that concept of like, how do you give somebody tools to help you that may not have the same knowledge or skills about that same outdoor adventure?
Oh man, I mean, I think you hit on so many of your answers, Kelsey, in that question, which is having an agreement about how that needs to look. For a great example of that is, yeah, I plan on being back before dark, right? If I'm not back before dark, what's going to happen? That way, if I say I'm going to be back before dark and then I'm not, and then you call search and rescue, if we've already decided, okay, what's going to happen if I'm not back by dark? Okay, you're going to call the sheriff's department. Okay, so now I know. So now I can't be mad if I just had a bad wax night, because we already decided what's going to happen if I'm not back by dark. So I think the more specific plans and protocols for what happens when those plans don't work out is usually the most important. Like if I'm going to be back by dark, and I really mean like, okay, if I'm not back till 2 hours after dark, then get worried. Then I'm not saying what I mean, and I'm not making an effective plan.
Especially if you're going to go have, a drink with friends after skiing and you forget about it for a minute, right? You got to think it through what you're asking of that person that you're giving that responsibility of helping you. Making sure that it's clear enough that they can do something, because I think most people, Matthew, maybe you say differently, but I think most people are cautious that they don't want to call it search and rescue on something that could just be, a car, something that could be mild. And so people tend to, at least as far as I can tell, either call when things are really bad, right? Like it's not the earlier stages of things. And maybe that's better. I don't really know. I guess I would ask the group what your take on, or Matthew, what your take on that is it better to be cautious and have somebody out searching for somebody when it is just a bad wax day, or is it better to, I don't know.
Yeah. And if anybody wants to weigh in on that answer, I think feel free, because I think there's not a right answer. I would rather have search and rescue looking for me when I'm not in trouble than to be in trouble and not, and have nobody calling. And, that's not a dump on the really valuable resources and time of those volunteers. But I think it comes back to, as much as possible, having a specific communication on when things should happen and what happens when that doesn't happen. And even so for example, I do know people who will go like on the picnic loop on Sugar Bush, right? Which takes hours and doesn't have cell phone service, who take one of those in reaches in case, some accident happens and a broken bone, you don't want to be dragging yourself out. So I think, so in the outdoor world, redundancy is key. And by redundancy, you mean a backup to every plan. So maybe your plan is to be out at a certain time. If that doesn't happen, somebody's going to check in on me. If that doesn't happen, I've got my inReach device to do an SOS. You know, I've got my lighter with me in my pocket. If that stops working, I've got my waterproof matches in the bottom of my bag. So redundant, I mean, we can't be redundant with everything. We're not going to bring 2 tents. We're not going to bring 2 sleeping bags. But then you have like an emergency blanket is a redundant shelter. So I hope that kind of starts to kind of create some clear communication. I think it's especially hard for family members. You don't want to have to guess. And so I think that's why coming back to the clear communication is important. Yeah, so hopefully this kind of, we can start to dial in a little bit more of maybe some of people's specific curiosities, but knowing how weather and conditions can impact the specific terrain that you want to travel on will be super important. So for example, slush on the lakes. This year, you know, you've probably heard about how the Devil Track is slushed out right now, and we're not doing snowmobiles on the Devil Track. Can't even groom something for that. The same is true in the Boundary Waters right now. And slush can be, can shut down your travel. And I think anybody up here probably understands the concept that heavy snow falling on ice, water comes up through those cracks as the weight increases. So then you got this slush on the bottom underneath your snowpack. And when you have, you know, unfrozen water on a lake, and it's 5 degrees out, and you step into that slush with your snowshoe, and then you pull that snowshoe out and expose it to that air, that slush freezes instantly. Now you have basically bricks attached to your feet. So having some sort of awareness of what the conditions are, maybe even before you get out, is really helpful. And trying to determine that before you get too deep into that. I was out on McFarland Lake last weekend, and we encountered really bad slush on our travel out to Pine. And a member of our group actually went through the ice in a slushy area close to shore. And it was a little nerve-wracking for that person to be up to their hip with one leg. And we almost had to call the trip, but luckily in my pack, in my waterproof pack, I had a second pair of boots and a second pair of socks. Coming back to that redundancy, probably don't always need that, but I was able to provide, it just ended up being those extra wool socks, but we were able to stay out for the day. Nobody's life was in danger, but comfort was also in danger, so redundancy. Another great thing for this time of year is, you know, if you want to go out and ski across some lakes, you know, we know what happens to the snow. You know, in the morning when it's cold, you get a nice crust across the lake, and you can cruise across the lakes on skis, on snowshoes. You stay up on top of the snowpack, but as the day warms and as the sun, that solar heat hits the lake, it starts to soften, that crust weakens, and you know, could be going super fast out in the morning to a destination like Rose Falls, but in the afternoon you're post-holing on your way back, and it could take 3 or 4 or 5 times as long to get back where you came. And so that's a good, an important thing about understanding how conditions change depending on the weather, the temperatures, and the season. Don't, you know, if you are having a great crust travel, be aware that that could change. And so don't go too far if you still have to get back. Another example is river stability. I was out on the Devil Track yesterday morning, and you know, if anybody's been on the Devil Track, you know that that is such a beautiful river to explore, summer or winter, and especially because you get this nice sidewalk path in the winter that you can just follow everybody else's route. But what happened yesterday morning is a good example of what's happened many times. With the warming temperatures, the river can fluctuate. the packed, spaces over certain parts can get thin. They can even wash out. And we had a section go out under one of the folks in front of me, and they went in, just shin deep, and luckily they didn't get water in their boots. But that's a hazard. And one thing that helped this group that I was out with was that we know that river, and we know it from traveling it in the summertime, knowing the depths and where the deep pools are and where it's fairly shallow. When I first started traveling the rivers, I just imagined that if I fell through anywhere, I would get sucked into a deep pool and pulled under the ice, and that would be my grave. And maybe if you don't know the river, that's a good assumption to make. But if you can know that river, if you can go up the Onion or the Devil Track or explore the Cascade, when you can see what's happening in the river before it's frozen. And, so if it's worth it to you, you want to get out in the rivers in the winter, go out in the other times of the year and get to know that place, because no people's recommendations or following another person's path up a river doesn't need to substitute your sense of security for what you actually know from your own experience. And that's really important. But there are ways that we can know with a lot of certainty what is safe, like with ice thickness, especially ice skating time of year. You don't want to, you want to check the ice depth before you go out on a lake. And, I know some people that will go with 2 inches. I like 3 inches. And just because somebody goes skating out on a lake doesn't mean you should just go and assume it's safe. Always check for yourself. Bring something to cut through that ice, like a hatchet or an ice pick or something, and check those depths.
I'm so glad you brought up the skating, Matthew, because I think about the wild ice. People were obsessed with that the last couple of years, and wonderful opportunities for seeing clear, ice and all those things. But I actually know 2 people that broke their arms out, something you would have not thought of. But depending on where they went, I can't imagine that the ice thickness was the component they were worrying about, right? But they didn't necessarily think about what to do with their own body parts if they fell, and how they should land, or what they should do with their, how they're driving themselves home, especially if you're further up the trail, if that happens, especially if you're not going out with a group. So I'm glad you're talking about that wild ice stuff.
Yeah, super important. And, some people really like to adventure alone. I do, with a lot of things, enjoy solo travel, but there's really having a buddy out there is so safe. For anything like going through the ice or falling and breaking a wrist. And I always have one of those things that I always have in the bottom of my bag is a first aid kit. And in that first aid kit is splinting materials, triangle bandage. You can make a sling with that. You can make a more robust splint with that. And so, I don't want to make it seem like, well, you have to do a wilderness first responder course to go ice skating or go up a river. But having a first aid kit and knowing how to use some of the tools that are in it are invaluable. And watch a YouTube video, cut a triangle bandage out of an old t-shirt. Those are all things that you don't have to take a wilderness first responder course to know how to use those tools, learn how to make a splint. So thanks for bringing that up, Kelsey. Those are super important things. And know how to assess the ice as you skate on it too. And go with somebody, with a lot of these things, if at all possible, I say go with somebody who is experienced and ask them all sorts of questions, so that whatever they know that you don't, you can leave that experience knowing. Never be afraid to ask. Okay, a few more things here, and if folks are up for it, I have a little bit of an interactive thing to do at the end. But this may sound intuitive, but understand how your behaviors can make you safe. They can actually help you. You have all this power in your own body to take care of yourself. For example, your own movement will warm your body. Eating a bar will warm you up, but not as much as jumping jacks or push-ups. And use this to your advantage. I was out duck hunting in the Boundary Waters a couple of years ago, and I started to shake uncontrollably in the early morning, and actually got pretty scared and started to lose that positive mental attitude. I was like, oh no, I've got to get out of here. I've got to get to the car. And then I remembered that I went and did some jumping jacks. I did some push-ups, actually quite a few to get the shivers away, paced around a lot. And I got my body warmed up, and I stayed out actually for a whole nother 24 hours. And if I had panicked and forgotten that skill, my trip would have been over. Also, the changing layers regularly is another important behavior to keep from sweating out and getting wet from your own sweat. And, you know, a lot of times, like when I'm exerting a lot of energy and then I stop, I put my puffy on right away because that heat I'm generating, I'm just going to trap with my body. And that'll keep me warm. So just remember, this goal of staying warm and dry is always priority. And I think we've kind of touched on this a lot, but knowing yourself and your strengths, for sure, know what you feel comfortable and confident doing, and knowing your own limitations, I think is one of the most important things. Some of that could be physical. For example, let's get to the SHT thing again. Maybe you've hiked from Pincushion to Lindskog on the Spear hiking trail in the summertime. You're like, yeah, I've done that. I know that I can do that in a day, and that's going to be easy. But in the wintertime, maybe you put on snowshoes to do that. Maybe you're maybe you're following a path, and then maybe you have to start to break trail. And that is a whole lot more work. And being able to realistically assess, okay, I'm breaking trail, I'm getting tired a lot faster. I've brought a map, or I'm using my phone, so I know I'm only halfway there. Can I make it the rest of the way, or should I start to turn back? And I think not having any shame around turning around because you've hit a limit is really important. Yeah, definitely the first time I tried to get out to Rose Falls on the Border Route Trail snowshoeing, I didn't even make it a quarter of the way there because breaking trail, I knew that that was going to be a bad idea. And I think mentally too, not putting yourself, like, for example, maybe Kelsey talked about, should I take my kids up a river and scrambling around on waterfalls, for example, like the Cadunts? Maybe that is a safe thing. But if mentally you're not confident or don't exactly know how to assess the ice, you're probably not going to have a good time, and you're probably going to be worried about your kids the whole time. And maybe that's also going to impair your ability and your judgment. So maybe that doesn't mean you don't go, but maybe that means you recruit somebody who's already been on the Cadunts 3 times this year to carry some of that responsibility for you to assess, and then you can just enjoy yourself. Yeah, and there's lots of specific river things we could talk about. So if we need to, somebody chime in. But I think then practically thinking about your gear limitations, like Tyler's My Little Pony sleeping bag, don't take that out for your first overnight in the Boundary Waters. Yeah.
Just to mention, somebody put in the chat when you were talking about bringing people with, thinking about who you're bringing with. I think you've made a good point about bringing people that are skilled, but they're mentioning like Cub Scouts or Girl Scouts on a first trip. Maybe go and do it yourself once before you bring a couple times before you bring those youngsters with, especially those are not the people that are going to rescue you as an adult. So being mindful about that.
Yeah, that's a really good point. And I love that idea of when you're in charge, not going into something blind. You know, like if you were a commercial guide, you wouldn't probably take a group of clients or to a place that you've never been before and that you don't know or at least you haven't like thoroughly learned about in advance. And so all like everything we're talking about, like knowing the maps and having those redundant plans, asking lots of questions, like, yeah, you could probably go do something for the first time that way and be really safe with all that preparation. Even more so if you're responsible for others, to have your systems dialed, and to know that you know exactly what to do if different scenarios happen. Maybe you've even like talked that through with another adult who's in charge. What are we going to do if this happens? If we run out of daylight? What are we going to do if somebody slips into the river? Those are all just, I can't say enough the importance of talking through what you will do before it happens and thinking through what you'll do before it happens, especially if you're responsible for children. So just bringing it into some of these key, like we've talked about a lot, and here are some key questions that I tried to kind of boil it down to when this planning process that we're talking about. Where do I want to go and what do I want to do? So maybe it's the spear hiking trail, maybe it's snowshoe, maybe it's the Boundary Waters on skis, maybe it's up the Devil Track River in my boots. Figuring out what the weather will be like, who knows where I am, and under that, you know, like what are the plans if things don't go well? That clear communication. What am I taking with me? So like that's the layers, that's the emergency blanket, change of socks, fire starter. What's the technology I can use? How can I use my phone if something goes wrong or to stay found? Do I have a map if my phone, something happens to my phone, if that technology fails? So this is just really basic questions that you don't want to have to answer these when you're out. You want to answer these before you go. Any other questions people are thinking of that, oh yeah, I'm realizing like these are things I should be asking myself before I go? Please chime in with them. And Kelsey, how are we doing for time?
It is 6:36. We still got plenty of time for people to bring up their own things, especially if they want to have a perfect example of something they want to walk through. I know that I've talked a lot about the things I was interested in tonight, but I'm really hoping others will pipe in too and say, I'm looking for this sort of experience. Maybe it's skiing, maybe it's downhill, maybe it's you're going out and doing something entirely different that I haven't even thought of doing before because I'm not that outdoorsy.
Yeah. That's great. I think like we could talk through some scenarios, but I think even more importantly, opening up to specific questions would be really awesome. So if you have some, go for it, Kelsey, but if other people do about specific types of terrain and travel, you know, we talked about asking lots of questions with somebody that you're going out with. Well, this is an opportunity to ask lots of questions.
Well, Matthew, I'm not going to do it, but I'm curious. I know you're a climber. Do you do ice climbing? And do you have any suggestions for people that are considering that as an activity to give a try?
Sure, that's a great question. I am an ice climber. I suppose I can use that as an identifier. Ice climbing is a bit of a niche sport, and there's really specific gear for it. So you could acquire all of that gear and spend hundreds of dollars to get it. Most people probably aren't going to do that. But if that's something that you want to get into, I think there's, you know, options to do it guided, and or to, you know, I've, for example, taken folks out, rented them gear from Stone Harbor. You know, they have boots and crampons and things like that that you can get specific to your needs, and gone with folks who have expressed interest, like maybe I want to do this. I want to at least try it first. But all like going with somebody who knows how to keep things safe. Ropes, things like that. With that said, there are these universal, so with ice climbing, you need a specific type of boot and a specific compatible crampon. That's the thing with all the pointy things on the bottom that go on your boot. You can buy universal crampons which can just go on any hiking boot. And they're so fun for being up here in the winter. It's not ice climbing, but you can get up a lot of the waterfalls on the rivers with those. That's not vertical ice. You don't need ropes, but you couldn't get up them in just a boot. I've worn them out to Artist Point, all the way out to the lighthouse, because I mean, you feel like a superhero with all these sharp points on the bottom of your boots. Even with these really cool ice formations that we've had all along the lake in the last few weeks, you can go play all over those. So yeah, that's another great safety thing, is like that traction. And maybe that's just, you know, yak tracks, but crampons as well.
I'm glad you shared about that. I saw a warning from a county the other day saying, please don't drive, but also please don't walk down the sidewalk. And I think we're talking about that in Cook County sometimes, about just if you want to go down and go to Artist Point. It looks beautiful sometimes, but also very dangerous if you don't have the right equipment or haven't thought it through. So that's a perfect example of places people might not go without thinking it through, without what you're recommending.
Yeah. And most of us who have yak tracks have fallen on the ice before. You know, that's why we go and buy them. Pain and mishap is the best teacher, unfortunately. But if you can learn without the pain, that's even better.
Do you have a favorite outdoor story of something that you felt like you learned a lot in, or something that we could think about as other people are processing what they might want to talk through?
Yeah, I wouldn't call this a favorite, but I think it was like my second or third year up here. And I was still really getting to know the boundary waters. I think it was my second fall. And I had bought one of those InReach devices, the Garmin style satellite communicators. And the night before, when I was packing up, I had filled my liquid fuel bottle. I had a stove that was compatible with liquid fuel, and I screwed on the cap and packed that in the same sort of open Duluth pack as my Garmin InReach device, and put everything aside, went to bed, got up the next morning, started the trip. And the mishap that occurred in that first day, I did not thread the liquid fuel bottle cap correctly. And so the fuel was leaking out. And so the fuel leaked all over the InReach device. And so we had gone in, and we were probably 3 lakes into the boundary waters in early October. So it was, I think, a higher risk time to be out. And this little device starts making noise inside the Duluth pack. And we pull it out, and it had gone completely haywire. The screen wouldn't work. It would occasionally flash on, and it was indicating that it had sent an SOS, an emergency signal, to the call center, which then relays to the local search and rescue. And I was sort of freaking out. I was like, okay, trying to make sense of what was happening. Is it actually sending an SOS? Is it just going berserk and nothing's happening? It's obviously not working right. And I was able to find a slot to kind of reset the device, at least to turn it off. But in my desire I wanted everything to be fine, and I wanted to continue on the trip. So I decided that it had not indeed sent an SOS, and it was just saying it had, or at least that's what I hoped. And so we continued on this, I think was a 4 or 5 day trip in October. And in the back of my mind, I was worried, what if somebody had been coming out? And so when we got to the car up at Seagull Lake, there was a note from the deputy saying, give us a call on the payphone when you get out and let us know you're okay. And yeah, so the device had actually worked. It had sent this SOS signal, and search and rescue had came out, and they knew precisely the location that the device was shut off at, they could track when it started bleeping to where it was shut off, and they looked for us there and they assumed that we had an emergency. And, that was a great story because everybody was fine and everyone was safe. But it was my first real introduction to, I think, just even understanding those resources here in our county, in our community, that and these tools that we bring for safety. And that, there was a lot of things that I could have done differently in that scenario, like staying put or even backtracking to confirm the situation. I wanted my trip to continue, so I chose to see the situation in a certain light to continue my trip. And, even though nothing happened, every one of those search and rescuers that came out, they came out that day. They came out in the dark, they were out in the dark, and they were putting themselves at risk to respond to the situation. And so there's a lot of ignorance in that situation around, like, not even realizing that they would come out in those sorts of conditions. And so I think just, being more mindful of understanding my tools and how they work and the resources in the community and how to put all these other people as just a high priority as myself was a good learning experience.
I think you make up a good point, though, that it does take time for people to find you too. I know I pay attention to sometimes the call-in reports at the law enforcement center. And, I've seen people say that, like, we still have to get people out to you. It'll be 2 hours. And so you do have to take good care of yourself during that time that you're in wait sometimes for people to get to you. And being mindful of, like, what is going to be a stop point for yourself. Like, maybe, as you mentioned before, like, if you're starting to feel like it might be an emergency, doing something early about it, because if it's dark, if it's bad weather, all of those things hinder people getting to you. So just being thoughtful about yourself and the time, and also just the care of other people having to get to you. If maybe it's better for them to try to find you at 3 o'clock in the afternoon than 10 o'clock at night. And what and how have you deteriorated as well?
Yeah. Yep. And we're all a community up here. So.
Well, it just takes a long time for people to get to you. I know I was at a place where a car went off the ditch and, they were 45 minutes away. It didn't matter how bad or good it was still 45 minutes away. And that you just have to be thoughtful about that. I know I have some well-traveled people on this event. So if you have something you're wanting to have advice about or want to share or have just a comment, this is a great time to do so.
Stories too.
Yeah, that long teacher pause, right? Where it could be a long moment for people to be like, oh yeah, okay, finally I'll talk.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and especially if folks have questions that weren't answered, or I'm also highly aware that I easily could have gotten something wrong in this presentation and would love to have it pointed out.
I guess I have a question. I know this might depend on what people are doing and where you're headed, but it seems like winter footwear is often challenging to find. And I know you talked about layering, and I know that can be applied to the feet as well. But I'm just curious, like, apart from specifics like ice climbing, sort of like as a general outdoor foot layering system, I don't know if you folks like the mukluk or if you prefer more of like a hiking boot with an over boot. I would love to hear what works for you. And I know that might depend on the individual, but any tips would be great. Thanks.
It's a great question, Catherine. Yeah. I'm just going to throw out some of my thoughts, and I'd love if other folks could chime in. Because I think when I hear you, when I hear the way you articulate that, I could tell that you're thinking about the different options that are out there and some of the different advantages. Like the mukluks are amazing because your foot is moving on the terrain when you're using them, and keeps the blood flowing, and by far the warmest footwear that I can choose to use in the winter. And it is my favorite for warmth. But you have limitations to a muckluck. Like I had those mucklucks on when I encountered that slush out on McFarland, and you don't want to soak your muckluck. They're not waterproof in a full extent. And they don't have great traction if you're doing a lot of steep terrain. So great with warmth, but not great for maybe high traction situations or with water like slush or maybe on a river. I don't know if anybody here uses bogs or mucks, and that's sort of a high, sort of just under the knee or upper calf boot that is waterproof, usually highly insulated. I think a lot of them are rated to -30. I think that's -30 to avoid frostbite, not -30 to maybe not have cold toes. But yeah, great because they are waterproof, great because they have more rigidity, a more robust, firm sole. So great for slush, maybe decent for some mild traction or up and down hills. Certainly compatible easily with a snowshoe or universal binding. Those are some of my thoughts. Anybody else have footwear recommendations that you like? If you're sold on something, Catherine, Kelsey, and I want to know. But those two are my go-tos outside of ice climbing boots.
Thank you so much. I appreciate it.
Now, I'm not even outdoorsy, and mucks do me really well. So
Good deal.
And Kelsey, do you mean mucks like the waterproof boot or the mucklucks?
No, mucks like the waterproof boot.
Nice.
Yeah.
Hey,
I
Tyler.
just want to comment about boots in general and not to put too many socks underneath. Used to teach skiing years ago, and kids would come with 45 pairs of socks, and their feet were always cold. It cut off the circulation. And so, like everything else you've said today, Matt, experiment, practice before you go out there.
What do you do for socks, Tyler?
I got an interesting arrangement going on here. I've got some wool socks when it's really cold. I've got some bogs to plow snow because I'm pretty much sitting around the whole time and need some warmth. And so it depends on the weather out there. But layers is really good. I'm getting old and decrepit here and have to go to the hand warmers. I'll even stick those in my boot here. So
Yeah, and that's a great point. So hand warmers and foot warmers, which are not something that I've used, but I've heard amazing things about. Do you find those to be effective?
Well, as I said, for the 2 hours that I sit on the tractor for plowing snow on my property, it works very well. It's very helpful. And I'll just keep them in my socks the rest of the afternoon there to get warmed up here. But it does help. My daughter gave me a case of them for Christmas one year, and I just used them all up this year. But I don't know if I recommend that being out or dependent on batteries or chemicals when you're out in the wilderness there. I don't know. I'm looking for information on that as well.
That makes me think of mittens and gloves and things too, and how people swear by the figures. They're the two together. They're
Yep.
mobility, but not so that they can have fingers that are a little warmer versus doing.
Well, I bought a pair of mittens that belonged to Bob Superdot. It went to Denali, and they work pretty good, but I have to get some wool liners that went with those that Vicki Biggs Anderson made for me. So the combination of those and an inner glove keeps me nice and toasty.
Tyler, you're dialed.
I'm trying. I may get this all together one of these days.
Michael, Matthew, that kind of reminds me of the concept that people sometimes have frostbite that's already been well established, but they're just sensitive skin. Any suggestions for those that are out and about and are already have some predisposed to getting something that starts hurting early, when other people wouldn't have it maybe be as sensitive?
Yeah, like kind of like the Raynaud's crowd. Yeah, I mean, I think that, yeah, so a couple of things come to my mind, right? Which like you may just have to really work to find the right type of gear. And what somebody else may say is good is not necessarily going to be good for you. But I know some people with a lot of sensitivity that have had to go living up here with even the like a mitten, a down mitten with a waterproof over mitt or something like Tyler's described. But I think getting the gear dialed, you could even do the battery heated gloves or mitts with the hand warmers. But one thing that I think has been fairly consistent with folks that even with some challenges is that, and this is pretty consistent across the board, is that there's usually initially when getting out in the cold and activity, there's an initial experience of the digits getting cold. And if you stay out long enough and if you heat your core up enough and work intentionally to get the circulation moving, like as ice climbers, we have our hands up above our heads when we're ice climbing. And so the blood doesn't flow. And I think that sort of simulated a little bit of what some folks with difficult circulation have. And one of the things we do is that, the arm spinning, 100, 50 each way. And that, getting that blood circulating and finding all the intentional ways to do that, heated mittens, swinging your arms around, doing whatever it takes, even if you feel really silly doing it, it's helpful.
Well, Matthew, I think your presentation tonight has covered all the grounds and all the ways, right? If you're a person that is just out shoveling snow, you probably learned something about layering tonight. Or if you're a person that is going to go for a greater extent into the wilderness, also learn some tidbits of safety. And there's so much that we couldn't cover. I didn't even think about people being out biking on the ice or all the other things. I just saw somebody doing on the clear ice and thought, oh gosh, that's magic. But that's a whole different safety thing than talking about skating on the ice and all the different elements out there. So we just kind of dipped our toe into the safety of the wilderness. I encourage anybody that wants to learn more, reach out to us. We'll see what we can do about a further presentation in the future, or let us know if there's something else we can share tonight as we have a couple more minutes. But I just want to say thank you to Matthew. You came with so much knowledge, and we're so welcoming to share your stories and experiences. And thank you to those that attended. You were able to contribute in great ways that made us be more enriched tonight. So thank you so much.